along. Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon session. I hope you're caffeined up. If you're anything like me, I'm feeling a little bit tired at this point. It's been a full day. But we have an interesting, I hope, panel and a session for you. We are going to be discussing how to shift our economies and the financial system that underpins it towards a more just future on a thriving planet. We've had several sessions on a similar theme here today, but I hope that we will contribute something novel. And my name is Beatrice Krona. I'm a professor of sustainability science at the Stockholm Resilience Center, Stockholm University. I'm also based at the Royal Swedish Academy of Science, and it's my honor and pleasure to moderate this session today. Now, when the world's leaders met here in Stockholm 50 years ago, there were already worrying signs about a distress to climate, about degrading ecosystems and environments. And since then, things have not really gone in the right directions. The human imprint on our world has just increased. And if it were not for the mitigating effects of the living ecosystems, which has a dampening effect on our emissions because it's absorbed some of them, then we would have actually breached the Paris target already. So therefore, this conference marks, I think everyone agrees, a critical moment in human history. And we really need to find a new way to structure, measure, assess our economies, and also find new practices for how to invest and finance those economies so that we don't saw off the branch that we're sitting on. So with us to discuss these possibilities, we have a very impressive panel, including Eric Usher, who's the head of the UNEP Finance Initiative, and you may have seen him on some stages around here already today. The UNEP Finance Initiative is a global partnership that brings together more than 300 banks, insurers, asset managers to develop sustainable finance and a responsible investment agenda. We've got Elena Almeida from the London School of Economics, and who's been a contributing author to the report on central banking and supervision to try and address biodiversity loss, financial risk, and system stability. And we also have, last but not least, Anders Wijkman, who's a Swedish opinion leader, an author, and also the former co-president of the Club of Rome, and who's now involved deeply in the Earth for All initiative, which we'll hear a little bit more about later. So, but first, to set the scene, a brief summary of a report that was actually launched yesterday. Name of this, Economy and Finance for a Just Future and a Thriving Planning. And this report was commissioned by the Swedish Ministry of the Environment as an independent input into this conference. And it was led by my colleague, Victor Galas, and from the Stockholm Resilience Center, with the support of David Colliste and a group of contributing authors. And it builds on or synthesizes decades of research on the topic of economics and finance for sustainable and just development. So I want to hand over to you, Victor and David, to come up and give us a short summary.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So let's just dive immediately into the report because we have some limited time. We were asked and tasked to reflect a little bit about the 50 years of progress in governance and the role of finance and the economy. What has happened in the last 50 years that we need to consider when we talk about the financial sector and our economies? And I think the biggest change and the most important change, in a sense, is this. It's humans. It's the fact that we are a marvelous species. We create beautiful things, but we're also a force of power, and we're shaping the Earth system and all life on Earth at this moment, which is an immense responsibility, of course. One of the things that, of course, you're familiar with, and something that sets the stage for any discussion, we believe, is the fact that we've entered the Great Acceleration. This very rapid rise of human activity on the planet affecting everything that we see on planet Earth at the moment. What is important to remember as well, and something that sometimes gets lost a little bit in the communication around this change, is the fact that we have also created a simplified planet. We've lost large amounts of biodiversity on land and in the oceans, and that makes us more fragile to change. I think that's an important observation to add to the Great Acceleration. We've also, during these 50 years, discovered that there might actually be some boundaries on the planet that we need to respect if we are to create a safe future for all on this planet. Another thing that has come out from research in sustainability science and earth system science and ecology is the fact that there are critical tipping points in the world on ecosystems, all the way from local and maybe even up to the global level. And then as a last point, and something that we are experiencing every day now, is the fact that we, as a global community, are more connected than ever, meaning that a shock in one part of the world has the potential to trigger and create cascading effects in other parts of the economy and other people. So it is essentially a very different planet we are on today, 50 years after Stockholm, 1972. This is, of course, something that you know already. Something that I believe is important and that we also discuss in detail in the report is the fact that the global economy has changed a lot as well. We're seeing a very big change in the way the financial sector and the corporate sector are operating on this planet. Our colleagues founded this term called Keystone Actors, essentially that we see a consolidation in industries that are shaping our planet, so putting potentially Earth's future in the hands of very, very few companies in many of these sectors that we need to create a better future. Another thing that we discuss in the report is that we're seeing quite a big consolidation as well in the financial sector, and that has implications. If you look into all the sustainable finance initiatives out there, they're massive. I mean, there are just a few numbers there. 115 partnerships, over 6,000 members, 10,000 collaborations on sustainable finance. But in the end, what we're seeing is also the massive concentration of influence through ownership in the so-called in passive investments and the so-called big three. We believe that has implications. If you start to look into sectors that are defining our future on the living planet, that's also in the report, you can see an increased influence through ownership in key companies that are modifying what we call sleeping giants in the Earth system. So how do we use that? Is it possible to use that influence in a way? We discussed that in chapter 5, if you want to know more about the details. But the world, we have created more, of course. So David, you're next.
Yes, in another part, in chapter 3, we discuss the responsibility for this excess use of natural resources that is evident in the Great Acceleration. So who is responsible? Where does the excess use come from when it comes to natural minerals, biomass, and fossil fuels? So this recent research from Hickel et al. Shows that the US alone is responsible for 27% of the ecological overshoot, the natural resource overshoot. And adding to that, the EU and the UK have 25%. If we look at all the high-income countries in the world, they together represent 74% of this excess overuse of resources, but only 16% of the world population. But besides this skewed responsibility, we're also looking at the effects of what's happening. So while the high-income countries carry a big historic responsibility, lower-income countries have less responsibilities of the ecological breakdown and much less ability to cope with the consequences in the form of adaptation, sea level rise, flooding, and drought. So in that sense, the ecological changes are increasing the inequalities that are already evident. So what do we need to change? So one chapter in the report is discussing the use of indicators, alternative indicators, and how we need to think about indicators. We're introducing the indicator iceberg with 3 different levels. On the top, we have take a snapshot. So the indicators that are just evident above the surface, the 10% of the iceberg that we can see. So this is what we see typically when we look around us. But what we need to do is to look at trends. So we need to go down under the immediately evident and look at trends, observe trends over time, such as the Great Acceleration. But understanding the Great Acceleration and what it means also shows the intertwinedness between the socioeconomic development and the Earth system trends. So to understand that better, we need to look at the underlying structures. And this we can do when we're looking at different indicators when it comes to how indicators for human well-being, indicators for macroeconomic performance, and indicators for investments. So here the first example is from different indicators of human well-being. We have the Human Development Index that in a way take partly a broader picture by looking at not only at income but also at education and health. But it doesn't really dive deeper down under the surface by not acknowledging the dependence of the biosphere. So we have the Planetary Adjusted Human Development Index that was launched 2 years ago by the UNDP, where the Human Development Index is combined with also planetary pressures. But those planetary pressures are also only relative, unfortunately, so they are not assessed against frameworks such as planetary boundaries. So they don't really go down and understand and reflect the underlying structures. We have the Sustainable Development Index that had been proposed by Hickel as well. And that is better accounted because it is accounted directly by accounting for the planetary boundaries transgressions. So in that way, it partly go down a bit deeper. When it comes to macroeconomic indicators, GDP is an indicator of a flow, right? What is consumed and produced in a country over a year. So that's a very much of a kind of snapshot picture. We have our colleagues that have developed at the Natural Capital Project the gross ecosystem product, which much better reflect the underlying natural capitals. However, to fully grasp natural capitals, it's important to understand that they are not substitutable. Different types of natural capital, for example, cannot be substituted for each other. And then, of course, we're looking at different financial indicators. So we have the environment, social, and corporate governance ratings, the ESG ratings. And here we argue that they really do not reveal the underlying structure of what is going on. To begin with, which we show in this picture from Beatrice Krona and others' research, is that first they are not precise. That is, across different raters of ESG raters, they measure different. Like different investments get different ratings, so they are not precise in the way that they are not the same across raters. But what is even worse here is that they are not accurate. They are not accurately representing the environmental impacts. So a lot of the indicators or the metrics used for the ESG ratings are self-reported. And also, when it comes to environmental impact, maybe the only one where there's some progress is when it comes to measuring carbon emissions. But other than that, they are not accurately representing biosphere indicators. Over to Victor.
Thank you. So in terms of measuring what matters, of course, you always see pictures such as this. So climate investments seem to be increasing over time, and you can count it in trillions. But one of the challenges is, of course, looking back, is when we talk about new investments. So, for example, the post-COVID recovery investments, actually about 3% were directed towards protecting our biosphere and making us better stewards of the biosphere. Another aspect related to the ocean economy, where 1% can be classified as investments towards sustainability, meaning that 99% of investments into ocean finance are not sustainable. And as a last point, the IPCC made an assessment of the funding needs to achieve the Paris target, and of course, investments in developing countries need to increase by 8 times to be able to, every year, to be able to reach the Paris target. We need funding up to 29 times in the agriculture and forestry sector. And we also noted that actually oceans do not have a number in the IPCC assessment. It's not even there. One of the most important biosphere systems that we have. Very quickly, because I think we're running out of time, we're talking about tipping points in the Earth system. Of course, the Amazon being one of those that has been mostly discussed and debated. What we note and observe in our report, and you can find the numbers there, is the fact that we're still, of course, the financial sector is still contributing to the Amazon approaching that potential tipping point. We did an update on the numbers that we published in 2018, and we found that capital still flows through tax haven jurisdictions to sectors that are associated with deforestation risks in the Amazon, summing up to $21.5 billion US dollars. There have been investor engagements in the Amazon, but has had limited impact. So there is a bigger understanding in the sector about deforestation risks in the Amazon. That's quite clear. But we know for a fact that deforestation still increases and accelerates in Brazil. Of course, part of the political situation in Brazil. And as a last point and observation is the fact that we are not seeing proper mobilization from the sector on these critical tipping elements or sleeping giants in the Earth system. So most engagement on the Amazon, for example, much less on boreal forests, for example, or other tipping elements. Going through this quickly, one of the concerns that we raise in the report, and something that the sector needs to take much more seriously, is the fact that we know there are domino effects. So climate change impacts on ecosystems, which is partly created through the influence of the financial sector, but of course it could feed back to an impact on investments. These type of domino effects are very common, not just for the Amazon. They're part of the Earth system. Some of these domino effects are known, but others will just evolve as surprises. We just don't have enough data, or we have too limited understanding. And the ambitions from the sector to collect more data and create better models will just partly address this challenge. It's not going to solve it fully. We made a quick assessment also in the report in terms of these domino effect risks, and there is an increased interest in the sector and by financial supervisors and central banks to see what these look like: climate, nature, financial sector. The focus is mainly on European and US-based financial institutions, so we know very little about the impacts on other big economies. But again, there is some interesting progress, and I think we're going to discuss that a little bit during the panel conversation as well. David.
Yes. So the last chapter in the report is a call for action. And we're going through what is needed today and how do we move ahead. What's the transformative capacities that are needed for people and planet? And to begin with, we focus on defining a new direction. And the foundation of that is, of course, acknowledging the new planetary reality. We are now in the Anthropocene, with a great acceleration really paving the world for a different future. So we need to acknowledge that in order to also imagine different futures with a thriving humanity. We also need to create enabling conditions. So this includes tapping into norms and values. And we are very happy to see, actually, that the good news is that norms and values across the world, across the G20 countries, for example, show that people are really requesting climate action. And what's beyond that, they also want policies for biosphere stewardship. So there is a will from the people in the direction that we're talking about. So this is something we can tap into because we know the importance of values and norms in creating behaviors. We also need economic policies that are based on a systems perspective, acknowledging both social, economic, and environmental factors and integrating them. We also need to move without consensus. Although consensus is good as it brings force forward, we're in such an urgent situation now that we need to move ahead even without consensus. Third, we need to phase out. And this includes replacing ineffective indicators that are not accounting for the underlying structure that I mentioned before. But it's also about dying with dignity, to finding ways to replace an economy that does not function. For example, we will lose, in this transformation, we may lose jobs in the fossil fuel industry. Some of these will be replaced with green jobs. But losing one's job is not only about an income, it's also about an identity. So this is something that needs to be accounted for in the transition. That also noted that the Swedish Prime Minister mentioned in this morning. And finally, we need accelerated investor action for resilience. We need investments toward a new direction. So we see there's a great and increasing interest in sustainable finance, but at the moment, it's not reflected in where money is invested. So this needs to change. So our planet has changed profoundly in the last 50 years. And the future, a just future on a thriving planet, maybe look bleaker now than it actually did 50 years ago. But we also learned there is a big potential for change from science, innovation, and our action-based experience. So while the science of today is overwhelmingly clear about the need to change, I think we need to think about the slogan for the Stockholm Plus 50 again. This is our opportunity, but it's also our responsibility. The report is available on this link, where we also have some illustrations in the respective chapters. And now we will leave over to Bea, the moderator.
Thank you very much, and an applause for the nice summary. It's okay.
The link.
But thanks for summarizing. It was a really excellent summary of a much longer report where you lay out the challenges, but also some actual tangible ways forward. And I'm now, while we get our panel up to take your places somewhere there, just pick your chair, we have time for one or possibly two questions from the audience. So if you are keen to ask something, please raise your hand and there will be a mic coming your way.
Are we moving here?
What?
You want us to stay here?
No, yeah, well, if there's questions, yes. Otherwise, I'd like you to step down. But otherwise, I can also say, if there are no questions now, sometimes things take a while to sink in. David and Victor will both be around after the session, and as you said, you can always contact them after. But with that, yes, we now have our panel in place. And our discussion today, let's see, will follow loosely the set of, no? Yes? No? What's going on? It'll follow loosely, try to follow loosely, this diagram, the themes that came out of the report. And
it's a bit difficult to see.
It is a little bit difficult to see, but you don't have to worry about it because I will guide you through the questions. But first of all, transformation differs from adaptation, right? Adaptation is about adjusting responses to changing just circumstances in order to remain on a current pathway or a trajectory. But transformation, that involves the creation of a fundamentally new system. So that's what this is about. And now I'd like to start us off at the top of this wheel, defining a new direction. And my first question goes to you, Anders. And it's about Earth for All. Because Earth for All has championed this transformational economics as a term. And I wonder if you can lay out a little bit about what is that?
Well, Earth for All is a report that will be launched beginning of September. But we are already ready with a draft. We took the initiative about 18 months ago. The Club of Rome, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Studies, Stockholm Resilience Center, and Norwegian Business School. And our starting point was really Limits to Growth in 1972, which had a very clear message. You cannot continue material consumption, to increase material consumption indefinitely on a finite planet. Unfortunately, the world didn't really listen to that wake-up call, so we've been progressing more or less on the conventional path, as you know. We started with sort of a basic premise, namely that the economic system we have is destabilizing the nature, including climate, of course. It's destabilizing societies. We have widening gaps, and we still have almost 4 billion people living in poverty in this world. And we value the short term much more than the long term. In a way, we disregard the future. And since the report emphasized that we humans, we are shaping the world, of course, we in the rich countries, we are particularly shaping the world. Our footprints are so much bigger. In the International Resource Panel, we did a calculation that material footprints in a country like Sweden is around 27 tons per year. In Africa, south of Sahara, it's around 2 tons. So there's a colossal difference. So we asked the question, given where we are, is it possible to provide well-being for the overriding majority of 9 to 10 billion people towards the end of this century without destroying the planet? And we have come to the conclusion, yes, it is possible, but it will require transformation in a number of areas. We have looked at 2 possible scenarios, one that we call too little too late, which basically is continuing more or less as today. We do a little bit here and there in the right direction, but not enough. That will lead to accentuated warming, biodiversity loss will be aggravated, social tensions will rise, etc., etc. And then we looked at the other scenario, which we called giant leap, and where we identified 5 so-called turnarounds, where we think systemically world governments have to approach a different pathway, addressing poverty forcefully, inequality, empower women, rethink food systems, and rethink the energy system.
Let me jump in there and ask, because in that narrative of an alternative future that Earth for All is sort of crafting, what's the role, or what role does the financial sector play there for transformation?
Well, the finance sector plays a very crucial role, of course. In order to address poverty and inequality in particular, we need to rethink financial markets. We need to assist low-income countries to have access to credits. We need debt relief for all low-income countries, because debt is an enormous challenge for them. We need also to rethink trade systems. Low-income countries have to be able to protect their infant industries, just to mention 3 examples.
Yeah.
But the financial markets are absolutely critical, and we suggest that the IMF should use special drawing rights in to a much greater extent, and make them accessible to low-income countries, which so far they have rarely been. So that's at least 4 examples. I could go on for hours. I won't.
I know you can, but this is actually, it's really good, because this is not meant to be exhaustive. It's meant to flag up some examples.
And I would like to add that one critical thing in the report is what Victor was talking about, and David. We measure the wrong things today. We have to start measuring the right things. And within the financial sector, we should start really trying to get hold of how much of all the money that is traveling around the world is pure short-term speculation, and how much is really supporting real economy investments and investments moving in the right direction. Yes. We don't know that yet, because we measure the wrong things.
Yes. And for that, we need to measure what a way of measuring if we're moving in the right direction. And we'll come back to that when we speak to Eric as well. But let's move to the next step in this process of developing transformative capacities, which is namely creating enabling conditions. And what could be more appropriate than looking then at central banks and financial regulators as creators of such enabling conditions. So you know what's coming up, Elena. I know you've been deeply involved in looking at the role of central banks, most recently in this, and their role for safeguarding biodiversity in this report with the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System. It's a network of central banks and regulators. Now, recognizing, though, that different central banks have slightly different mandates, you still have come up with some broad recommendations that all central banks could essentially move on. Do you want to enlighten us?
Sure. Thank you for your question, and congratulations, Victor and David, on the publication of your report. Let me start with some background. I was part of the core NGFS and Inspire Network team working on producing this report that Beatrice mentioned, the central banking and supervision in the biosphere. And the report laid out recommendations on what central banks and supervisors can do. And this report benefited from inputs from 25 different central banks and 28 research institutions. So there was a deep engagement with a broad range of central bankers from advanced countries to developing and emerging markets as well. The report concludes that biodiversity loss is a source of financial risk and falls within the mandates of central banks in their responsibility to maintain financial stability. And we set out 5 recommendations that all central banks can take right now to address the problem of biodiversity loss. The first is to recognize that biodiversity loss is a source of economic and financial risk. And to some extent, we've kind of achieved this because as a result of the report, the NGFS and its members are all in agreement released a statement acknowledging that nature-related risks could have significant macroeconomic and financial implications. This is a great first step. They've also set up a Nature and Biodiversity Task Force, which will look at mainstreaming biodiversity loss in addition to all the work that they are doing on climate change. And they've just announced who the co-chairs were just this Monday. So that's a great first step. The second recommendation that we propose in the report is for central banks and supervisors to start building the capacity and necessary conditions for understanding and assessing biodiversity-related financial risk. And this could be training their internal staff, but also bringing financial institutions along with them on the journey as part of a co-learning. And this is very typical in emerging and developing markets. In turn, these financial supervisors, these financial institutions can communicate with the firms that they lend to on how to look at how biodiversity loss affects their business operations. So this is a co-learning journey. The third is for central banks and financial supervisors to start assessing the degree of financial exposures to biodiversity loss. The simplest step is to conduct an impact and dependency assessments, and that helps them to understand how biodiversity loss affects the financial system and economy. In our report, we highlighted 5 central banks who have already done this: the Central Bank of the Netherlands, France, Brazil, Malaysia, and Mexico. In addition to doing all of this, they could develop scenario analysis and conduct stress tests specifically on other environmental risks beyond climate change, and develop useful metrics and tools to assess the state of biodiversity-related risks. Our fourth recommendation is for financial supervisors and central banks to explore options for supervisory actions on managing biodiversity-related risks and mitigating the negative impacts on ecosystems. This could include setting supervisory expectations on governance, risk management, disclosures, scenario analysis, and even financial conduct. Our fifth and final recommendations is for the central banks and financial supervisors to work together to improve the financial architecture, the global financial architecture, and mobilizing investments for a nature-positive future. This could include action on taxonomies, ESG ratings, even though that seemed quite low, that seemed to be quite problematic based on Victor and David's presentation, work on monetary policy and improving their non-monetary policy portfolios.
Yeah. Thank you very much. But I also know we spoke before, and I know, well, I guess some of us, like me, I haven't known a lot about central banks until quite recently, and looking into it and feeling like, well, the mandate of the central bank surely is mostly to, manage stability of the financial system. And I know your institute came out with a report recently where they actually reviewed the mandate of about 135 central banks. That's from the Grantham Institute, and found that actually over 50% had a mandate for sustainability. 12% actually explicitly so, and the rest, it was sort of often secondary requirements to support government policy. Now, we spoke a little bit before, and you said, don't make me focus only on mandate, so I won't. But could you, talk a little bit about what you think? If mandate is not the thing to hone in on, then what is? And can you give us some examples? Because I know they vary quite a lot if we look at central banks around the globe.
Sure. So just to explain the role of central banks to those of you who are not aware, central banks typically have two mandates: to maintain price stability and to maintain financial stability. And it is clear that maintaining financial stability means making sure that the risks from environmental degradation, including climate change and biodiversity loss, does not pose a risk to the financial system as a whole. And therefore, all of this ecosystem degradation falls within their mandates if there is a financial risk, and we all agree that there is. So from a risk management perspective, and central banks should be concerned and should start taking action. But there is also, as you say, as you outline, central banks that have mandates to support sustainability actions or even to support government economic policies. And we see this more often than not in the mandates of central banks in emerging and developing markets. And they have broader mandates and can affect things like creating a green taxonomy. The People's Bank of China and the Central Bank of Malaysia recently did this and incorporated biodiversity considerations within their green taxonomies or climate change taxonomies. So there are differing ways in which central banks can engage on the topic of protecting and preserving the environment and moving towards a nature-positive future.
And I think that's actually a really important takeaway from this session, that the mandate of central bank is not a God-given truth. It is something that is politically, chosen. And I think it's interesting to see that mandate can be variable and can be perhaps in some ways much more conducive to a sort of a green economy than it is in some of our more mature economies. So moving along the path then here to the about transformative capacity, I wanted to touch on this notion that David also mentioned on moving without consensus. And my eyes turn to you, Eric, because we've heard from from Victor particularly about, complex systems dynamics and the fact that we have these threshold effects, and we simply can't sit around and wait because a lot of the Earth systems, the planetary systems, are changing very fast. And there'll be non-linear change in a lot of cases, thresholds which are going to be passed, and we can't wait. And in such situations, it may simply be necessary to move without consensus. And you've been part of setting up voluntary initiatives to act. You sit on, as a UN representative, on several more coalitions of willing and progressive actors that are trying to move ahead on issues that matter to them. So my question to you is, in your honest opinion, have those kinds of large-scale coalitions worked? And can you point to some specific measurable effects or impacts?
Well, thanks very much, and I will speak to that. However, I would want to call out, since the signing of Paris, one of the most important developments is what we've just heard here. And actually, in the lead up to Paris, Mark Carney, who at the time was Governor of Bank of England, he gave his speech at Lloyd's of London, which was on the tragedy of Horizon. This was around the same time the Pope also gave his encyclical. And within the financial markets, the tragedy of Horizon had as much or more impact. It was really a waking up, and essentially it was saying climate risk is financial risk. We as financial regulators need to pay attention to it. And there's been incredible progress since then. 18 months ago, I would not have expected what we've just heard now on nature. Okay, so central banks say, okay, climate is a financial risk, but nature? What's that got to do with us? And yet the progress that's being made is quite impressive. The financial sector, like many industries, it's all about signaling. When you hear regulators talk about these issues, even before they've regulated, just talking about it sends very, very important messages. And we have to think about the financial sector not as a monolith. It's made up of many moving parts. It's an ecosystem, many actors, public and private. And within those, you have leaders, you have laggards. And there is a real question of what is the theory of change, of how we can navigate some of these very significant challenges. As you mentioned, and I think probably many of you had heard, one of the messages out of Glasgow was this huge alliance, Glasgow Financial Alliances for Net Zero, GFANZ, horrible acronym, amassing $130 trillion of commitments to net zero. 130 trillion, it's about, depending how you measure, it's about half the financial system stepping up. Great, job done. Everybody's on board, problem solved. Now, we manage a number of those alliances, the bigger ones within that, and I'll speak a little bit more specifically about them. And I think there are some positive aspects, and there's a very important role to voluntary action to get started. However, the cup half full part, half empty. Some of you may have seen a couple of weeks ago, Elon Musk, not that I always like what he says, he had another one of his little Twitter wars where he called ESG a scam because Tesla had been kicked out of the S&P ESG index, and Exxon was still in and much higher rated. And he said, how is this possible? Which obviously points out some of what we heard about the ESG industry. It's definitely got some work to do. Now, the reality is ESG, and there are a lot of different interpretations, but in its core, it's really about managing risks, and it doesn't get into scope 3, which, Exxon itself is a good corporate citizen in scope 1 and 2. There's just this small detail of scope 3 about what people do with their product. Tesla in scope 3 is actually probably not bad, but scope 1 and 2 are, they have some labor practice concerns. They have various issues that actually gets them quite low rated on ESG measures. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done of how do you measure performance. Just as a reminder, 1494, there was an Italian monk who drafted the modern framework for accounting. Essentially, our accounting standards have been 500 years in development. ESG, 10, 20 years, depending what you take as a starting point. So there's a lot more work to be done in terms of ESG. In the last couple of months on ESG, there have been regulators in Germany, in the US, in the UK, who have taken cases, investigations against some major financial institutions in accusations of greenwash around ESG, how it's being promoted. And I think one of the basic issues is ESG is more narrow than people are often led to understand. So an ESG fund might be sold as solving the climate challenge, whereas when you read into it, there's things like Exxon inside it. So there's obviously some mis-selling going on. So there's a lot of challenges happening. To talk about this GFANZ a little bit, because there are a lot of sub-alliances. The first of these alliances is the one that we convened called the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And what these are big investors like Allianz, AXA, in the Nordic region, Nordea Life and Pension, or Alecta in Sweden, Storebrand in Norway. And essentially what they're doing is they're saying, we're going to set a target, 2050 net zero. That's the easy part, as we know. It's the interim target. And for them, they got going 2 years ago, and they said our first interim target is going to be 2025. And we're going to come up with what they call their target setting protocol, which is suddenly going to be a framework about how do we set a target. And what's very important about these intermediate targets is they have to be science-based. And they use the One Earth model from University of Technology Sydney, UTS, which basically is based on IPCC, no and low overshoot scenarios, and basically saying, well, how much do we need to reduce by 2025 to be on track to get to zero by 2050? They've published their targets. You can see them. They're online. Typically, they're in the range of 25 to 30% reduction across the portfolio. So this is quite significant. There's a banking alliance called the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which is big in terms of it's about half of the global banking community is signed on, and they're starting to issue their targets. So big banks like Citi, like HSBC, and others have issued, and you can read into them, and they say they're too late for 2025, they claim. So they're focusing on 2030, where we know we need to see about a 50% reduction across the board. And you see what they're aiming for. And I would take Citi, for example, says in the power sector, we're going to reduce emissions 53%. HSBC actually 71%. Very large numbers in 8 years' time. Now, what does that mean? What they expect, what we expect, they're going to invest a lot in renewables. They're going to stop doing coal. Oil and gas, well, things are changing by the day based on what's going on. But I get asked a lot, does the war in Ukraine mean a new lifeline for oil and gas? And in a purely commercial basis, nobody wants to invest in oil and gas today, because you invest in it, and 10 years from now you're told to shut it down. So it's not viable. The question is, will governments incentivize investments in oil and gas, which I think is the real challenge there. Yeah. But another example would be within the banks, mortgage lending. So if you need to reduce 50%, and let's say you're a city, you have 10 million mortgages, households that you're financing for their homes, and you say, okay, we want to help them do greening. We can top up the mortgages to be green households. How do you reduce household energy use, or essentially emissions, particularly by switching 50% in 8 years' time? It's very, very challenging. And then you think, well, what are the most efficient households? Who has the most efficient households? It's low-income neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And so it's actually against the law to restrict financing to a low income, and yet that goes against the ability to reduce emissions. Yes. So these financial actors are really tied up with some challenging issues. I think on the positive side, they are making a lot of efforts. You have these high-level targets, and then there are a lot of changes going on within the organizations to say, how are we going to get the reductions? Initially, it's voluntary, but they're hearing the signals from the regulators that they have to get it right. So it's a little bit of a dance where they know this is their chance to show whether they can do it. Mm-hmm. And there's pressure, regulators. There's also civil society has always been putting pressure on, keeps pressure on. Hiring, it's hard to hire, particularly millennials, unless you have a sense of purpose. Your customers, your investors. So essentially, they don't really have a choice. They need to do it, and they know if they don't do it right, the regulators are going to ratchet it up in a way that probably they're not comfortable with. So I think we are in a sense of movement now. It's not perfect. We unfortunately, the Italian monk or whoever doesn't have 500 years to get it right.
Nope.
So we need an acceleration. Even as we see in the regulatory side, the acceleration is happening. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he is very engaged in this agenda, and he's realized, as we know, public finances are going to not solve these issues, so we need to get the private sector on board. But last point, it has to be with accountability and integrity. And as you probably know, he has established a high-level expert group to figure out what sort of conditions need to be applied on these types of initiatives to make sure that they do have accountability and integrity. So we also have high hopes that will be part of the solution.
Okay.
There.
I mean, you flagged up lots of thoughts and triggered lots of questions, I think, for me. I know, Anders, you signaled that you wanted to ask or chip in here. But before I do, I just wanted to say one of the things that stands out then, and which I think authors of the report also didn't intend, that, of course, economics and finance, it doesn't stand free of regulation. And as you said, this is a triumvirate where we need to work together. And the financial sector on its own will never be able to solve some of the challenges, specifically for the reasons that you said, that there are some perverse incentives in the system at the moment. I want to just come back and poke you before I give the word to you, Anders, again, on the accountability, on the accounting system, and on the metrics and what we're measuring. You touched on it already with the ESG and the fact that the ESG is mainly was conceived as a way to determine risk to corporations and risk, therefore, to financiers. But since ESG has become the tool by which we also promote sustainability, I want to poke you a little bit and ask just, it doesn't capture today really impact on the planet. Yet we know that impact on the planet from corporations is what will come back through feedbacks and create systemic risks to, and even not even systemic, but actually direct risks to the financial system. So from where you sit, where do you see those kinds of impact metrics coming in so that the green products actually become more green and don't risk creating a ginormous greenwashing bubble?
Yeah. So one of the other very important developments in Glasgow was the launch of the accounting system today. In most countries, the standards are set, what's called I will go into too much acronym, IFRS, International Accounting Standards Board, IASB. And those have been around 500 years, essentially. In Glasgow, the IFRS, the mother organization, formally launched a parallel International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB. This is a very important development because all corporations around the world basically know they need to report based on these standards. So that is an important development. Now, the reality is, will it be enough? Probably not, and there's gonna have to be rising ambition and pressure to get ambition. But once again, when you think of a bank, historically, all they keep track of is risk and return. Essentially, every mortgage they lend for, they have information about what's the risk about that homeowner to borrow from them, and are they going to pay back the loan, and what's the interest rate? How is it profitable for us? Now, what we're asking banks to do is to say, now you have to track impact. Now you need to know what's the job creation, what's the climate benefits, all of these things, and so. All of a sudden they're saying, oh, no, we need to put new systems in place. Now, there's an incentive. If we talk about mortgages, there are green bond buyers in the market today. Sweden was the leader, but there are many around the world who will buy essentially packages of green mortgages. But you need to be able to track the impact to be able to do that. So a lot of work needs to be done there. This ISSB is an important development. We need armies of accountants to understand this stuff. And we have to admit that the awareness is very low within the main corporate sector on these issues. People read about it in their Facebook feeds, but what does it mean for their day job? That's only just starting to change. So we're at the beginning.
So I think that touches on what Elena was mentioning as well. Bringing up the basically capacity building when it comes to these questions throughout the corporate community, the financial community, and also the central bank and regulators. And I think it touches on, if some of you were in the session earlier this morning, on the Yolanda law legislation. I heard from a legislator in Argentina, which is very interesting, which is specifically about that, but for the public sector. I think we need something similar for the financial sector. But Anders, please, you had some thoughts on this.
Well, yeah, I had a few comments. One is that, Eric, you just said that awareness around these issues is quite low in the corporate sector. In society, it's almost non-existing. And I do recall I was at the seminar organized by Positive Money in London a few years ago. And there was a relatively young member of the Tory party who stood up and said, when I became a member a few years ago, members started, and he had a background in the financial sector, and he was asked by some of his members if he could give lectures, and he said, what I found out was that only a handful of the members of Westminster had any inkling of what the financial sector is all about. So the lack of awareness also means that, I wouldn't say you get away with whatever, but the system is so little transparent, and there is such a lot of terminology that ordinary people don't understand. So I think that's part of the puzzle here. The other thing is, it's not only about energy and fossil fuels. It's about materials. I I told you I should be in another meeting now with Janusz Potocznik because I'm a member of the International Resource Panel, and they are talking about that. We have come to the conclusion in the IRP, in our most recent major report, Global Resources Outlook 2019, that 50% of carbon emissions are directly linked to the extraction and production of materials, and 90% of biodiversity loss. And since virgin materials are being extracted like this, 300% increase since 1970, and that will continue unless we totally rethink how we manage this.
Yes.
And still today, virgin materials are less expensive than secondary materials. So we can talk a lot about circularity and resource efficient, but it's not happening because the framework of the economy is what it is. And unless we change that, it's going to be very difficult for the financial sector also to deal with this. Because if we extract more and more virgin materials, we will have pollution, we will have damage.
If we talk about then, what is it that needs to be done in order to change that? Is it taxation?
Yeah,
or
taxation, rulemaking, of course. You could stipulate, like the European Commission is now considering, that for certain categories of products, you should have a certain ratio or degree of reused or recycled materials in new products.
Yeah.
So you have to put requirements on design. I mean, products that are put on the market should be relatively easy to reuse, recycle, refurbish, recondition, remanufacture. They are not today. Normally we use materials once and then we discard them. So, and then the cost structure. To me, a tax reform would be very, very natural. Lower the tax on labor and raise the tax on the use of nature.
Yeah.
It's difficult in a global economy, I know, but we have to move in that direction. Otherwise, we will meet here in 10 years again, and the indicators are even more negative.
Yes, and that is why the start of this, number one, is defining a new direction. So back to that again, reimagining what can be, imagining in a different way of having your economy. Now, we're drawing to a close soon. No, actually, we still have some minutes, but Nope. Nope, not there either. Let's see. The title of this session is Economy and Finance for a Just Future and a Thriving Planet. But we've been talking mostly about a thriving planet here at the moment. So I want to touch on the just and on inequality and justice. And just say, when we move, as we see in this diagram here, up here on the fourth, promoting biosphere stewardship, it's really important that we do this without forgetting about the inequality issues. And so I want to pose a question to anyone in the panel, but Elena, I know you definitely have something to say about this. Is there a risk when we focus a lot on how the financial sector can help push the system in the right direction that we lose sight of inequalities? And is there a way that we can move forward without doing that? Some thoughts on that?
Yeah. So in the context of central banking or the financial sector, I think there is a limitation with the role of central banks and financial supervisors to think about inequalities, especially when we go back to thinking about what their mandates are. But I think there are some links to understanding that what we're talking about is the interlinkages between climate and nature. And here, central banks and the financial sector already understand the climate change problem, or at least they're making sounds as though they understand the climate change problem. And now we're beginning to see the emerging picture with nature and how that can affect the economy and financial system. What we cannot do is ignore the voices of people that are outside of the system. So that is the youth, the indigenous peoples. They are the ones who are most impacted by the financial policies that we make and have the least say. So with regards to these things, there is a compounding and dynamic interaction between climate and nature, and what this means for different stakeholders within the economic system. For central banks and supervisors in, say, the emerging and developing markets, they often have policies to enable financial inclusion. And perhaps this is something that can be considered when we move forward to creating a more just society that looks into considering people and the planet. But I think this type of transformation requires a very deep level of coordination between policymakers. So the primary responsibility for confronting ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss, I think, sits primarily with governments. And they need to address the market, institutional, and policy failures that lead to ecosystem decline. And actions by financial sector players, including central banks and supervisors, can support the move towards a better planet, dealing with biodiversity or nature-related risks. But it's a complementary role. They're not the primary enablers of such changes. And just a quick example, I am originally from Malaysia, a middle-income country that is one of the most biodiverse in the world. And I am encouraged by the actions of the National Central Bank, who is trying to understand what biodiversity loss means to the economy, the financial system, and taking actions to address those risks. Mm-hmm. But this is juxtaposed against a very difficult political climate in which there is still a belief that economic growth can only come at the expense of degrading the ecosystem, the environment, and this would have the most impact on the people that are relying on nature for their livelihoods. For example, the indigenous peoples. Yeah. Exactly. So we have a lot of attempts to undertake degazettement of protected areas for which we have indigenous people living on these places, and they are at the front lines of protecting our planet and the stability of our planet. So this is just something that's personal, personally related to me, and not necessarily that relevant to central banking and the financial sector. But if we are to build a future that is sustainable, both in terms of low carbon and nature positive, this policy coordination and commitment is vital.
Yeah. And from the example that you gave and from what you spoke about, and I'll open up here for Anders and Eric to chip in. My question is, do I understand it then that it's going to be very hard for actors in the financial ecosystems to necessarily promote equality? That needs to come from the sort of enabling conditions of other institutions, perhaps including central banks, but not only. They can be regulators or policymakers from all disciplines. Is that a correct statement, or am I?
In terms of the framing, when we talk about transforming finance, I would prefer to say transforming the economy, and what role can finance play in helping enable that. And that also means at the community level, there are a lot of jobs, as we heard earlier, it's going to change. And what's the role of finance in helping those communities make that transition? So, the green bits, there's plenty of capital for green technologies. And now some would maybe question they have something new that's unproven. Okay, but in general, greening is the easy part. The problem is just supporting the green technologies does not green the rest of the economy.
No.
So the much more challenging part is, what do we do with industries and communities who are based on modes of economic activity that are carbon intensive? And how do we help navigate them away from that? And that takes this triangular, the relationship, policymakers, regulators, everyone, civil society, everybody has to come to bear to help. And the financial actors, they're only enabler or catalyst, but part of that. They won't decide it. I think one of the very interesting things that's happening now, and we have to see how it bears out, is how do you shut down industries in a proper way? And some of you might know this German auction, which now is about a year and a half ago, where they basically said, we will take the bidders for shutting down coal capacity, what's the least cost per gigawatt requirement to shut down a plant. So state subsidy essentially to round out. And now we're seeing other developments, even some purely commercial ones, where investors are going in, buying up some generating assets to shut them down because they are able to do it in a way that is economically viable. We need a lot more of that, or we need other approaches. And that definitely, when you start to talk about the just transition in the community, it gets much more tricky, because it's not only about dollars and cents, it's absolutely about jobs and livelihoods. And once again, I think finance is a tool, but it's not. It's only part of the solution.
Of course. And I mean, what you just said now touches on this part of the diagram that we haven't really spoken about, which is the phasing out and dying with dignity. And what role does the financial sector have to play in that as we let certain industries die with dignity? Well, as you said, I think the important is to think that it's not a monolith, and that the financial sector can but needs to both reduce its harm, and that is part of it, that is phasing out, but also boost the good. And that's where it comes into these alternative livelihoods or alternative industries. We could get into, but we won't. But I think it's just important to note that some people will probably think quite naturally that the way that the financial sector plugs in here is through divestment. And if we have some time, we might come back to look at divestment.
To make one comment on divestment. It's absolutely a tool in the toolbox that at the end of the day might be needed. But we just have to remember, if you have an investor in a Shell oil and you divest from them and Shell leaves the oil field, if it's still legal to dig up the oil, someone's going to come in and do it.
Yes.
And so the real question is, how do you make that an uneconomic activity?
Yes.
And that's actually not a financial question.
Exactly. That's when we come back to the regulations, the taxations, the phasing out that has to come from other parts of society. Anders, you looked like you were waving. Was there something else before we start?
I mean, when you asked the question, how can the financial sector contribute to reducing inequality? I find that question difficult because, as I understand it, and it's not only Piketty who has made that point, growth of capital is much faster than growth of the economy. We have seen in this country, in Sweden, that a small percentage of those who own the capital, they become richer and richer, whereas ordinary people, their salaries have, if not gone down, but stagnated over the years. And I think this is a pattern we see almost everywhere. And I think it will be accentuated the more the high-tech sector expands. Because in the high-tech sectors, you have this phenomenal growth of wealth in a short period of time. So how to counteract that or how to balance that is a big question. And that's why I think really a tax reform would make sense, because then I don't think as many jobs would disappear as fast as otherwise. And then if you instead tax capital, and I think you should tax short-term gains, what I call speculation. You should tax that more than you tax ordinary dividends. Finally, in Earth for All, we have, I think, a very interesting proposal as part of the package. We talk about the universal basic dividend. And the idea is that we should put a fee, or a tax if you like, on the use of commons in the world, the commons. And it's not only the natural commons, but also something like the financial infrastructure, the internet, the use of our data, etc. And if you put a fee on that, and that is not totally free for corporations to use those riches and assets, and then you have a fund that could distribute that as equal dividends to each and every individual. We have one example in the real world today, and that is Alaska. It's not a good example because the dividend is made up of oil and gas revenues. But still, it's a good example because every year, each citizen in Alaska gets $1,200 US as a sort of increase in their income. We have calculated not very exactly that if we did this in the global economy, an average family of 4 would benefit in the range of $15,000 to $20,000 a year. And that would mean a lot for poor people, a lot. So, and we would see it as a social safety net during a period of rapid transformation of the economy.
Very interesting. We are coming up to a close, and I would just like to ask you, or I asked you in advance, to think if there is anything that you wanted to flag in terms of gaps or things that are still missing and what really needs to be stepped up in order to, reach the ambitions that we have when it comes to economics and finance. We don't have very much time. We've spoken about a lot of them already, but if there is anything that you would, as a last sort of thing, 1 minute to flag for the audience.
I would say, and actually we're talking the previous session we were on with Anders, is that the financial sector is looking to the science more than ever. Frankly, they don't trust the politicians so much, like many. In certain places, we don't have a proper response, but the science in America, in Europe, in Asia is the same. You look at the parts per million. So they've realized that they need to understand the science. And in this challenge, they need to understand sectoral transition pathways. For the steel industry, how can you get steel to zero emissions? For cement, for agriculture, for building and construction. They're looking for that knowledge that helps them, because then they take these pathways and they benchmark their clients. And they basically say, are you ahead of the curve or are you behind the curve? Ahead of the curve, we want to finance you, we want to invest with you. Behind the curve, we're going to tweak up our risk ratings because we worry you're going to be out of business. This information coming from the scientific, from the engineering community, from social scientists to understand behavioral change, all of this becomes more and more relevant. So we really need to bring these communities together.
Thanks. As a scientist, of course, that's music to my ears. Elena or Anders, before we finish.
I think I just wanted to reiterate that first we must recognize the deep interlinkages between climate and nature. This is something that is obviously happening now, or at least as I heard from yesterday's session on finance. This is something that's starting to emerge as an area of interest. And second, that it requires a deep level of coordination across policymakers. But I also wanted to flag that there are positive signs of beginning to understand the risks surrounding planetary boundaries. As Eric had already said before, things have progressed in the past 2 years that we couldn't imagine that is occurring now. So for example, in terms of the project that I was leading in this report, when we started the project at the end of 2020, we had 5 central banks that were interested in exploring the issue of biodiversity loss. Now the NGFS, which has 114 central banks and financial supervisors and members, acknowledging that biodiversity loss, nature loss, is a source of economic and financial risk. That is tremendous progress, probably a good place for me to end on a positive note.
Yes, but from 5 to 140 is success, I would say. Anders, a final note.
Well, coming then from an old member of the Club of Rome, people would probably expect us in this report, Earth for All, to focus the main attention on climate and the ecological crisis. But funnily enough, we don't do that. We focus most attention on the social issues, because we believe unless we address the social issues up front, there is no way we're going to build trust in society to deal with the long-term issues. So I think the social and environmental agenda, they have to go together, and we have not really done that in the past. If you look at the NGO community, you have environmental NGOs and you have development NGOs, they rarely meet. So I think that's probably most important. And the second thing is also from somebody who has been on a journey. I started off as a member of parliament on the center right, but I've learned a lesson, and I've learned that markets alone is not the solution. We need intelligent governments and governance, and that's, I think, and I think the pandemic showed that once there is a real problem, society accepts measures to be quite drastic. And I hope society will do that in the future as well. But we have to bring everybody along. We have to address the social issues.
Yeah. Thank you so much to the panel. And as I noted in the introduction, it's a critical moment for humanity, you could say. We need to find new ways of doing economics, of structuring our economies and finding practices to finance it. And this session has tried to provide some food for thought on how to achieve that, and based on the latest scholarly thinking, but also from the prominent thinkers and doers of our panel. And I hope that you leave here fueled with some new inspiration that you can propel action in whatever domain that you're working with. And thank you for choosing to spend your afternoon with us. Tack.